And here we go. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Raising Multilinguals live on it's an afternoon here just outside of Montreal. We live in a little town outside of Montreal. And the snow has melted, so it's getting nicer and nicer. We did have a dip, but it's getting back to the 20s. So I'm looking forward to the weekend. How about you, Uta? How's everything going over there?
Here, everything is going fine. We have sun. It's a little bit later than on your side of the world, but that's okay. Hello, everyone. I would like to welcome everyone from wherever you are connecting. And we are very honored to have Professor Annick De Houwer as a guest at Raising Multilinguals Live today. Again, because she was already our guest 2 years ago when she talked about how to speak effectively with a bilingual child. So for those who don't know her, and I think there are very few, Annick De Houwer is director of the Harmonious Bilingualism Network. She was trained in linguistics and held professional positions at the universities of Antwerp and Brussels in Belgium, and at the University of Erfurt in Germany. In the US, she has been affiliated with the Ernest Kennedy Shriver National Institute of Child Health and Human Development, and was a visiting scholar of several top institutions there. De Houwer's research has mainly focused on bilingual and monolingual children's language development. She has addressed both linguistic and socio-psychological aspects of language development and created the concept of harmonious bilingualism. She has published widely and is the author of The Acquisition of Two Languages from Birth, a case study, and Bilingual First Language Acquisition, an introduction to bilingual development and bilingual development in childhood. She's currently the president of the International Association for the Study of Child Languages, and more. Thank you so much, Annick, for taking the time to be our guest again today and to share about a topic that you highlighted in your article that I will share the details in the description and in the comments in a moment, the danger of bilingual monolingual comparisons in applied psycholinguistic research. So, hence the title of today's interview, Why It's a Really Bad Idea to Constantly Compare Bilinguals to Monolinguals. Thank you for being our guest, Annick.
Well, thank you so much, Uta and Tetsu, for having me. It's a pleasure to be here for the second time and on a completely different topic.
That's right. That's right.
Absolutely. Yeah. And maybe before we enter really in the gist of today's topic, for those who don't know this yet, can you please specify who is monolingual, who is bilingual? Because not everyone remembers or knows what the differences are and, yes, where to situate oneself.
Right, yeah, there are lots of ideas about who is monolingual and who is bilingual, and people who do not work on bilingualism have sometimes very restrictive ideas. I think that somebody who's bilingual has to know and be able to function in two languages at a very high level, equally high levels. But that's not going to happen very often. So in academia, it's accepted basically that a monolingual person is really a person who understands only a single language variety. So I also talk, not only about languages, but language varieties, because every way that we're speaking is a variety of language. For instance, you always speak in a local, regional way of speaking, and sometimes it can be a way of speaking that's more general, but it's still a kind of language use, more or less. So a monolingual person really just knows one way of speaking and understanding. And bilinguals, well, that's everybody else, which is a lot, millions and billions and billions and billions of people in the world. Mm-hmm. And so, and there is a huge range, people can, like little babies who are raised bilingually, they have learned to understand two language varieties, maybe a regional dialect and a more standard way of speaking, or indeed two languages or three that people commonly see as different languages, for instance, Turkish, Russian, Kurdish, for instance. So they cannot speak yet, but they're able to understand words in each of these three languages. So they're already bilingual. And when they start to speak, they may speak just in one language. That's fine. So, but what's really crucial is being able to understand words, sentences in more than a single variety. So that's where it really starts. And of course, it's a huge, a lot of people in the world can, in fact, fluently speak, read, and write, and understand 3 or more languages. There's plenty of those.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think many monolingual people are surprised when they hear that there's actually more people who are bilingual or more than monolinguals. They're usually very surprised. But from today's definition, I've never really thought of this so I guess in depth. But you say variety, and this word doesn't give me a very strict definition in mind, but dialect kind of does.
It can be a social dialect, for instance, African American English, for instance, and Standard English.
Or British English. So if you speak American English and British English, you are considered a bilingual?
Yes.
Or is there like a spectrum almost, if you really think about it? Because some dialects are very close. It's almost just like an accent difference or just a vocabulary use that's different.
I would say really when it's a different variety means it's more than just an accent, just the way, which is why American English and British English, look, if you're talking about an educated American English speaker who also can do a British accent, maybe that person's not bilingual. They can just do the accent. Or let's think of actors who can do an accent. Yeah, like Meryl Streep, she's fantastic in doing accents. I don't know whether she knows any other language than English. I don't know. There are several actors who do, but I don't know about Meryl Streep. But I'm seeing her, giving her as an example. She can even do foreign accents of English. That's perhaps, but that's just the accent, meaning just slight differences in pronunciation, but basically
there are some differences in vocabulary and expressions.
That gets to a different variety.
Okay. So
that's why I'm talking about educated people, because within the United Kingdom there's huge differences.
There you go.
There's huge different varieties, many different varieties of British English.
Yes.
So in terms of vocabulary, even ways of speaking, things people do within conversation, that it's really a completely different way of doing it, and that it's much more than just an accent, but that there's really very different ways of pronouncing words, intonation patterns, goes much further than just an accent, which is a little veneer, really, on how we're speaking. Yeah.
Yes.
But obviously the difference between, defining what is a language variety or a language, linguists also, it's not very clear, but it's definitely, I want to include language variety because it's really very important that people realize that somebody who's speaking, for instance, Bavarian regional variety, that is really Scottish different from standard German. Different. And so people are,
or Scottish from the English.
Absolutely.
Exactly. And that's important to realize, and there is not a lot of research on this, but it is growing and growing. Also for children, there's a lot more interest in studying those children who are learning a standard variety and a more regional variety, for instance.
Yes.
Or social variety, as the case might be with African American English, which again also has regional differences, yet again.
Yes. And then maybe, different regional varieties and some dialects as well, without maybe speaking them, but you understand them and you can repeat some things. And that actually is also something that is included,
Absolutely.
right? Or sign languages as well. So, I mean, that's another level, but
Definitely.
it's also language. Yeah. So.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. Absolutely, yes. No, I'm here speaking about spoken.
Yes.
The spoken oral language use. I'm also not talking about writing, because people can be bilingual, of course, in the way that they are able to understand only one language, but they're able to read another language. For instance, there are many Japanese engineers who do not understand English, but they can read English. But the moment you talk to them in English, they're lost.
Yes.
But so that's a kind of bilingualism too. It's a kind of a modality-based bilingualism. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So bimodal bilingualism,
so already we're off to a great start with.
Yes.
I think for our audience to really capture the complexities involved in research. In languages and how definition is important. We have to really find what we're talking about.
Exactly. We need to know if we're talking about apples or bananas, right? Somehow.
Especially if you're going to compare monolinguals to bilinguals, you need to know who you're dealing with.
Yes, absolutely. So as today we want to emphasize the need to stop with comparing bilingual to monolinguals in research and also in practice, and focus on bilingual standards maybe. What is now, or what led to the monolingual called ideology and monolingual bias? So all that caused now also why we are talking about this topic today.
Yeah. Why is it important, to even, consider what is a monolingual person, what is a bilingual person? Mm-hmm. Because many people who are both actually bilingual or monolingual, many of them will in fact have what is called a monolingual bias, which is rooted in a monolingual ideology. So an ideology is more at the level of a society, more or less. Mm-hmm. So a monolingual ideology that refers to the belief that people should only speak a single language, really, mm-hmm. in a particular society, especially for day-to-day communication within that society. Because let's be clear, in certain monolingual, societies, like in France, or in Germany, or in the Netherlands even, or in Flanders, monolingual ideologies reign in all those places, but especially in Europe, there is a realization that it is important to know foreign languages for communication at a larger scale. So that kind of falls outside that monolingual ideology. In the United States, that's not so much the case, because after all, they speak English, right? So anyhow, within Europe, definitely, and also by extension now in the United States and Canada, monolingual ideologies stem from nationalistic ideas in so-called these Western societies that arose especially in the 19th century and continue in great force today, and are always and always reaffirmed and reaffirmed every time, for instance, a government minister, as just happened recently, Minister of Education in Flanders, the Dutch-speaking part of Belgium, recently he was claiming that parents who spoke another language than Dutch at home with their children would no longer get social benefits. So this is how a monolingual ideology definitely gets reinforced, yes, and gets reaffirmed.
Yes.
Anyhow, now what's then a monolingual bias? Well, it's basically a discriminatory attitude that people have towards people who do not conform to that local monolingual ideology. So that includes people who do not speak the local societal language, and those who do speak it, but in addition use other languages for day-to-day communication. And it's very strange that even bilingual people, that they can hold a monolingual bias, because they might be comparing themselves to a monolingual ideal, really. Yeah, and that is a very sad thing.
Yes, or even strive for a certain monolingual ideal situation, like when parents want their children to learn English, one of the languages that every parent seems to want their children to learn, up to a very high level of proficiency, and then disregard or consider or start considering their own language as not precious enough and not worth to be learned or to be improved. Yes,
that's true. Yeah. Now we don't have, there's very little research, but I do want to mention it here by a person, a Polish scholar, Kamil Zubriski. I'm sorry, I'm not pronouncing that correctly, even though I did try and practice the name, but I'm sorry about that. Who's one of the only ones, as far as I know, who has done real research into what do people outside academia, who do they consider to be bilingual or not bilingual? And yeah, a lot of these ideas lead to people feeling inadequate, low self-esteem, which is very, very sad and unnecessary, right? Anyway, your next question probably.
Yes. I will share a link to Kamil Zubriski's study that you refer to in the comment section afterwards. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, I'm really very sorry. I want to again apologize to that scholar who I just wrote to a couple of days ago, because I found his study too late for my own article, and I'm really sorry.
Oh, okay. Oh, for the next article. So
I think we can maybe take a second. We already have a comment, with respect to what we've been talking about, and take a moment to acknowledge everybody that is watching right now on our different platforms, on YouTube and on Facebook. Thank you very much for taking the time. The discussion has already heated up very quickly. We've gone into some complexities of defining monolingualism and bilingualism. And here we have a little comment from Najwa. Yes. She says, "Thank you for this live. Parents I work with tell me I would like my child to be bilingual, but the child is already bilingual." So I think I thought of this also. Like, many people don't really consider themselves bilingual. They say, I speak, English and maybe a little bit of what my grandparents speak, or a dialect of this or that. In Taiwan, there's like different actual languages, Taiwanese, and India, there's like thousands of languages, right? They sort of don't consider themselves like multilingual speakers of all these languages. They just have like one, they feel like they have one strong language, and that's what they're monolingual in. So this comment, I think, really strikes a chord with me. They think that bilingualism is about symmetry between the languages, or that they don't really consider the other languages as languages, or like they don't merit this.
True. Many people don't even have a name for the languages, or the language that they have learned. There is a lot of shame going on.
There you
also.
go. So here we
because
definitely
it's not a big language, or it's not English, it's not French or German or Russian or Arabic, or Spanish. These big languages.
Or Chinese, right?
Chinese. Well, particular kind of Chinese.
Mandarin,
Great, thank you. We definitely promote, this thought that every language is important. It's not the number of people who speak it. It's not the geopolitical background of any language that makes it any less or more relevant. So hopefully all parents can transmit that to their kids, so that the kids really can have pride in all the languages that they
Well,
speak?
I think at this point, I really do want to share an insight from a former colleague. I'm former because sadly he had passed away, Pieter Muisken, a very important language contact linguist, who, you know, when you're like mentioning like every language has a value, well, you know, he said, well, look, yeah, in principle, in the abstract, yes, but in reality, if I just speak this one language and this is keeping me from getting food, getting a job, getting healthcare, then who the hell cares about that language? I need another language to get food, to get healthcare, to get education, and so forth. You know?
Yeah.
So I'd be careful to posit that with such a, yeah, so surely. And he was working with endangered languages, you know?
Yes.
We should think about endangered people primarily. Yeah. Right.
Yes.
Good call.
A little. I'm a professor. I'm used to telling people to criticizing them.
That's very good. Yes, that's absolutely what we need. I would like to share the comment of another Facebook user. That's funny. I hear that from my students too. Many speak Bengali and English. When I tell them that they are therefore bilingual, some are shocked. They seem to only think of European languages when it comes to bilingualism. And this is a very important aspect, right?
Yeah.
So when you have a lot of studies in English or that are highlighting the bilingualism in Western countries, then those who are not part of them have the impression to not be part of that. This is shocking. Yeah. It's sad.
Unfortunately, it's part of, you know, it still results from colonialism. Yeah. Unfortunately, yes, it's very unfortunate. You know, we have had this happening in of course, the Indian subcontinent and in a lot of Africa, where the local languages were not given any kind of value by the colonizers. The colonizers just zoomed in and took over with their languages, you know, and education systems still in Africa, when people vary in many places where children go to school, in primary school, they learn English, to read and write in English, a language nobody speaks in their village. It is a disgrace. Luckily, things have started to change. Also in India, I don't know about Bangladesh, but yeah, it's very unfortunate. Yeah, very unfortunate. Yeah.
Yes. So many pediatricians, teachers, and professionals in general tend to hold this monolingual standards for bilingual children. In assessments, bilinguals are compared to native speakers or monolinguals, implying that monolinguals are the norm. So can you please share what is wrong about the idealization now of a native speaker? And this term, I know that we could talk about a long time about native speaker, or also considering a monolingual as the norm. So it's actually two questions in one. Sorry.
Yeah, the idealization of a native speaker. Do you want me to talk a little bit about native speaker?
As you like. Yes, I put it there. I know it's like a trigger for many, and I try to avoid this term, but it's good.
Yes, well, it is still, yeah, a native speaker is not necessarily a monolingual. You know, a native speaker of a particular language is supposed to be, I think, a person who heard that language from early childhood onwards, right? But this is interesting because, of course, there's tons of children in the world who hear 2 or perhaps even 3, although languages from pretty much from birth. And according to at least one academic that I won't name now, well, you know, she didn't even consider these children to be native speakers of their languages. These children are bilingual. But in my book, if you're going to talk about native speakers, yes, obviously they're native speakers of 2 languages. Yes. And what does this mean, being a native speaker of language? Does it mean that automatically you speak that language very well? Not necessarily. There is huge ranges of variation between so-called native speakers in how well they use their single language or their language, because, as I said, native speakers of one language may become second language users of another language later on, right? They could be. So, and then there is, of course, monolinguals. Monolinguals are, by definition, native speakers of just a single language, and the poor monolinguals are just native speakers of that one language all their lives. Yes, they're missing out on a lot. I'm sorry, but that's their choice, and that it's fine. And you can be very well educated as a monolingual native speaker. You can have a wide range of skills in that single language, but at the same time, you can also have quite minimal skills in that same language. If you're not that well educated, you will have a much smaller vocabulary. You will be, you won't have that range of skill. You may not be able to write as well as Shakespeare did. Yeah. Or you may not be able to speak as well as Churchill did. And this is all part of the normal range of variation in people who know just a single language, and also in what is called a native speaker. So unfortunately, in our schools, especially in Europe, with a second language and foreign language teaching and learning, very often this, there is some idealized native speaker, some ideal that is being held up as something to strive for. Question is, why? And plus, what ideal is it? It's never the ideal of the monolingual native speaker who's not doing so well in their single language. No, it's always pretty much the top. Not quite Shakespeare and Churchill, but close. Yeah. So that's just not fair. It's just absolutely not fair. And the problem is, though, when you start applying norms that have been developed for especially children. So we have a lot of norms, not just for children, because we do have norms in terms of like vocabulary knowledge for people up to 99 years of age. It's called the Peabody Picture Vocabulary Test. And why is that used? Well, in cases of where people have Alzheimer's, perhaps, or aphasia, so where there can be some kind of assessment, and clinicians can find out whether perhaps there is an issue with language. Yes. So, but very frequently the assessment tools that we have been developed for children throughout their educational career. Well, we also have graduate, the graduate tests to be able to enter higher education in North America. All those are normed on just monolingual English speakers, right? So it's quite a feat for any second language learner of English to pass those GREs, the graduate record examinations. Quite a feat. So, but this is the thing. This is kind of expected. You should actually be able to function as well as a monolingual in your second language or in all your languages. And if you don't, something must be wrong with you. Well, that is discriminatory. And so what happens with bilingual children? Well, it really can affect their well-being, because pediatricians could be misdiagnosing normal variation that's going on within the child's language skills. They could misdiagnose it as impairment. On the other hand, they could fail to diagnose real underlying problems because they have this idea in mind that bilinguals are slower to develop language. That's kind of a myth that's been around ever since I started working with bilingualism, which is 45 years ago, and that myth is still around, and it's driving me nuts. Yes, it's terrible. It is so discriminatory. Unfortunately, it's being fed also by some unfortunate statements by academic scholars. But if a pediatrician really believes that a bilingual environment within the family is going to lead to delayed language development in both languages, and then parents come to the pediatrician and the child doesn't really say anything and is already 2.5 years old, pediatrician's going to say, oh, that's just because you're raising your child bilingually, no problem. Well, problem might be, and very frequently is, that child has a hearing problem, right? But they're not even being tested for that, for a hearing problem. So this is really terrible. This is really how that can affect children's and families' well-being. And obviously, there's going to be, even if pediatricians then suggest losing one of the languages, stopping to use one of the languages, and they never advise that you would stop speaking the societal language. That they never do. No. So there's a language hierarchy that's going on. So if you then do that, well, then you've lost a very important part of your family's life and identity, and perhaps even the possibility for your child to communicate with grandparents and other important adults in their life. So that's a really bad result of this idea of this monolingual bias. I have some more to say about that. Is that okay?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, and also what also happens is that when children who have one language at home that is not the school language and they come to preschool or school, usually in most societies, in Western societies, their home language that's not the societal language is totally ignored. And very frequently these children, especially if they're quite young, the results for them will be that these children will feel excluded, that they will withdraw, and very often, unfortunately, we have a lot of reports of bullying by the other children who have already learned, who've already picked up at age 5 or 6 these negative attitudes, this monolingual bias. Children are so quick at picking up social attitudes starting at around age 4. That's, they're quite metalinguistically aware. And so this is really a bad thing. And I've already mentioned for adults, as Kamil Zobzhitsky, I think that's it, said, the monolingual view of bilingualism, as he called it, has serious consequences for bilinguals' self-perception. Could be a source of insecurities about their linguistic skills, and more importantly, that our identity and self-esteem. Now, in foreign language learning, if always you're being evaluated against some ideal norm that you don't even know what it is, you always feel bad, right? Because how can you even come close to that? So how would that then motivate you to learn that language? It's just too hard from the start, right?
Yes, it's too hard, and it's also completely unrealistic, as you said, because this norm, this native-like or monolingual norm is something that you cannot even grasp. Maybe those who make the tests might have something in mind, but it's very generalistic, or it's not real, so to say. You cannot say it's like the person X speaks. So if you speak like that person, you tick all the boxes or something like that. So it's very, very difficult to do. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
And now you were mentioning that there are different ways, right? You mentioned research before, several approaches. What would be equitable methods to study bilinguals then, or multilinguals, or plurilinguals? How we want to
super important is to take into account the whole of language use of whatever persons you're studying, and not just focus on a single language. Because this is precisely what you're doing when you're assessing monolinguals. You are trying to approach all of their language. So why don't you do that with bilinguals? You know, that's already not doing that is what often happens is just totally ignored whatever other language, you know, non-societal language people are speaking. And in doing so, also, you know, to take into account the whole of language use, you need to also take into account people's language learning use and their history. And I'll give an example from assessments at school. Very important. Very, very frequently, children are already assessed at school at age 4 or 5 for their proficiency, their skill in the school language. Yeah. And if they're not up to par, then they have to wait until they get admitted and so on and so forth. Or they're going to have speech therapy, whatever. But it is really, you know, for children who have not yet had the chance to learn that school language, it is completely unethical and inappropriate to test children in that language that they have not yet learned. It's like this very old, you know, problem of the 1920s in the United States, where there were IQ tests of adult immigrants into the United States, Italian immigrants. They were tested in English. And the conclusion of the psychologists at that time was these people are so stupid, they cannot do, you know, they cannot do it. Well, of course they cannot do it. You're being tested in a language that you don't know. If I were tested in Turkish, Arabic, Russian, Mandarin, you know, people would probably also think I'm really stupid. I don't know those languages. But it is awful that this was considered true science, and it wasn't until decades later that that kind of research was kind of criticized methodologically. But in the meantime, decades of students learned that bilinguals are stupid. Yeah. So that's part of that monolingual bias and monolingual ideology. So in assessments, you should take into account the whole of what any bilingual can do. And you have to take into account also the time and opportunities that bilinguals have had to learn a particular language. And definitely not compare them with children who have had access to a particular language from birth, monolinguals or native speakers. Mm-hmm. Yes, that's one method. But one method that is that's a principle. It's not a method, it's a principle. Yes. In general. Yes. And for instance, in much more in research that maybe your viewers won't know about, or it's not such a practical thing, but it is a screening instrument. It's called the Communicative Development Inventory, which now exists in, I think, about 60 languages, and including language varieties, very important, which is used to screen very young children for possible language delays, because we know it's very important that very young children know a lot of words. And if they know far fewer words than their peers, there might be a problem. It's a screening instrument, so it's not an assessment instrument. It's just like, do we have a flag that's saying, oops, there's something we should pay attention to and dive into, right? So in that sense, it's a screening instrument. And researchers also use it for research, and it's a parental reporting instrument, meaning that it's a questionnaire for parents, because the children, when they're 2 years of age, so it's for children from 1.5 until more or less 2.5 or 3 maximum. Children, you cannot measure. Otherwise, there's very few ways to measure how many words that children know. But in a bilingual child, you cannot just ask one person to do this, one and the same person, because that person may know very little about the other language. So you have to involve more raters. So you have to be really very much more thoughtful in how you're going to collect data, how you're going to use this screening instrument and so forth. So those are more equitable, definitely.
Yes, and like you mentioned, now this communicative inventory should then actually be used by both parents or all the caregivers that have to do with the child in the different languages, right?
Yes,
so,
exactly.
And then compare what comes out of this, and then add, not in a deficitarian way. Is that even a word?
So deficit way, yeah.
Deficit way.
Yeah.
Instead of doing that, yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Right.
So we do have another comment that's right within this this topic here, and the user tells us that that's the danger of only looking at numbers. So referring to, in this case, the IQ test on immigrants and concluding that they were stupid. Yeah, I mean, when you look at just the results without really looking at the methodology, the whole premise of the study itself could be faulty. So,
in scientific research, methods are, if the method is bad, the study is bad. It's very simple. And should not be published. But unfortunately, there's still a lot of bad studies being published.
Yes, and unfortunately, also some bad studies are those who make the front page of some newspapers. I have to say, to not go further, but because otherwise we go into another direction. But
well, like you say, it's just that when we focus so much on just the outcome, sometimes it's just confirmation bias could lead you into a wrong direction just because you want this data to come out so much. You sort of jump into conclusions very quickly.
Yeah, well, and unfortunately, many scholars and researchers, well, they live in societies that have a monolingual ideology, and many of them share the monolingual bias. Unfortunately, this is one way where, indeed, scientists are just people who also have particular ideologies. And you have to watch out there.
Yes, especially if then this is feeding the bias even more.
Yes.
It needs somehow to take up another kind of glasses, another perspective that considers also another kind of context, not only the one that is given. Like you said, many studies also focusing on the societal language and not on the home language or the family languages, or variants that the children are exposed to at home or outside of the other context.
Well, the whole scientific methodology, I think, is good in that we encourage this open criticism, open debate, peer review. All this is, as long as this is really, really like open and truly in good faith, I think we're in the right direction. I'm sure there are.
Yeah, there are problems. There are
problems.
Yes,
always.
Always.
But the basic concept, I think, of the scientific methodology is a good one.
Yeah, but again, there are hierarchies. Some scholars are better than others.
Oh, yeah.
Exactly. You have the hierarchies of the languages. You have the hierarchies also in academia. You have the hierarchies a little bit everywhere. But it's a little bit
human. It's a human endeavor.
It's the human endeavor, yes. Now, this shift that we are trying to push or that we are trying to highlight is already happening somewhere, right? In your article that I share in the comments, you mentioned some of them. What is, in your opinion now, the best way to study the development of bilinguals?
Well, the best way is definitely to study bilinguals themselves without reference to monolinguals, because you don't need it. You do need to focus on bilinguals and try to, as we know already, there's a huge variation amongst bilinguals, as there is amongst monolinguals. That is true too. But the variation amongst bilinguals is much larger, much, much larger. And that is an important thing to recognize, and also to try and study the factors that are at the root of these differences, yes, in order to, as researchers and scholars, to just understand, you know, in a more theoretical sense, but of course also in order to have a foundation on which to give advice to families, to educators in schools, to clinicians, to pediatricians, etc. You see, that's really important when we know the factors that underlie particular profiles, bilingual profiles. So that's really the way to go, is to compare different bilinguals to each other in obviously a kind of a logical way, right?
Yes.
Yes.
Which in some sense can also justify the thing that approaching them from a monolingual perspective makes it somehow easier, because you try to reduce these parameters, the factors, and try to squeeze them into something. Whereas if you have the variety, the huge variety of bilinguals, multilinguals, when did they learn or acquire the languages, and in which context, through which means, to what extent, to compare them among them, and also the different languages, right? If you maybe you have bilinguals who have, let's say, Dutch, Italian, and French, but the order with which they acquired and learned the languages is different in that group. So what are the parameters then? I mean, it's highly interesting, but I can imagine it is also very time-consuming to elaborate these different parts and really to find a certain the parameters, or no, let's say the outcomes of these studies. Where are they leading us? What do we want to focus on? So I'm very much interested in knowing a little bit more about what can be done with this kind of approach, and also not only with children but also with adults, which complicates it even more, because then the context is maybe in higher education and with different work experiences in different countries. So it's very difficult then to find a homogeneous group to compare with each other, to get data out from that. But I see, please, I would like to just do a shout out to everyone who is following us on YouTube and on Facebook. Please share your questions in the comments. We're more than happy to address them and to discuss this further.
Okay. Yeah.
Yes.
All right. So earlier we were talking about the open debate, seeing from the different side, and I actually did come up with a separate question. Since we've been talking about not comparing monolinguals to bilinguals, but since we've been doing this for the whole, I don't know how many decades now, there must be some merits to it that still justifies that we continue, at least partially, to compare bilinguals to monolinguals. So could you let us know your thoughts on what merits there are that really justifies that we continue to do some research comparing bilinguals to monolinguals?
Okay. Well, I'm very firm on this point at this point in time in our research, namely, the answer to that question is completely no. There are no merits to comparing bilinguals to monolinguals. But I have to say that as others, I have done such research comparing bilingual children to monolingual children. If only, like also Fred Genesee in a very recent article of 2022 wrote about the monolingual bias, if only because we were working at a time that there was hardly any research on young bilingual children, and there was always this deficit idea that these children are behind in their language development compared to monolinguals, without, I must say, without any research backing that up, okay? There is no research. I have to be so firm in that. There is no research that shows that generally young bilinguals are behind in their language development compared to monolingual children. A lot of people worry about it. There is not a shred of evidence for this. And Fred Genesee, in his research, showed this to be the case, and so did I. So we did that, we've done that, we're done with that. But at the same time, in that research that I did then with Dutch, French, bilingual children, I found we should really compare monolinguals to bilinguals. And that could improve our knowledge of monolingual functioning and how it is supported. For instance, I found that the size of word comprehension vocabulary, so the number of words that 13-month-old infants knew, so these are kids that are barely walking, right? And we used the communicative development inventory to measure how many words they understood. Well, at age 13 months, the bilinguals knew a whopping 71% more words than demographically matched monolinguals who were also 13 months old. Mm-hmm. So this difference, what does it show? It shows that young children can assimilate and learn many more words than what has commonly been accepted as its limits, the limits of word learning at that age, based on just monolingual infants. And researchers later, in Canada, they found similar results with somewhat older children, I think. Mm-hmm. So in fact, according to monolingual norms, bilingual infants are 4 months of life ahead in early word learning. And that's a very large effect at that very early age. So 4 months out of 13 months is a very big proportion, right? And so word learning is very important for young children. So this is a major insight from bilingual studies that can inform knowledge about monolinguals. Mm-hmm. And the monolingual difference here is clearly related to the difference in what infants are hearing. So that is their language input. And although there is some research into the role of input for monolingual development, that role is much more highlighted in bilingual settings. And it shows that the input is much more important than is generally acknowledged by scholars who are working on monolingual acquisition. Yet, of course, again, bilingualism should not be upheld as a standard for monolingualism.
So the other way around is not necessarily justified, right?
For that, please. No, don't get me wrong. Now, and then your question, Ute, you're quite right, that the older people get, the harder it really becomes to really understand what's going on with functioning and so forth. In fact, this is one reason that I focus in my work. I've chosen, when I started doing research, I focused precisely on children because of that, because their system is still so small. Yes. And not so complex compared to older people. There are great challenges, of course, in studying older bilinguals as well. But more and more people are doing that and comparing different groups of bilinguals to each other and taking into account their language learning histories more and more. So there is hope. There is hope. Yeah.
There is hope. Yes, I saw in your article, which I actually shared in the comments, so people can read it. I will share it also in the description. You mentioned these studies and you link back to them. Yes. Absolutely. Yes.
Yeah.
So the merits of comparing bilinguals and monolinguals, right?
Yes. Well, thank you. Yeah, I mean, it's very clear. You're
not really.
And I really love how you really make sure that you're not taken out of context. In this point in time, this is based on what based on what's out there. There is no material merit, I guess, because I can think of things like logistics. It's easier to find monolinguals.
No, well,
in today's
excuse me.
world. I understand, but based on the definition you gave of monolinguals today, it now becomes much more complex, right?
To find them.
Oh,
Yes,
yeah.
yes,
In the whole of Europe, I doubt you would find one person who's monolingual.
Mhm.
I doubt it.
Exactly.
And it's a huge problem. And this is something that many studies, they don't even ask about. They don't even ask about.
So that would be a faulty premise, right?
Yes.
It would already become
That's a
a
logical
faulty premise.
mistake.
You're saying in your methodology that there's a cohort who's monolingual, a cohort that's bilingual, but your cohort monolingual is actually,
Bilinguals.
for all intents and purposes, contaminated, right?
Yes,
the data itself.
Exactly.
So I totally follow you on all that, but I'm saying the simplistic way of thinking would be that logistically it would have been much easier to just find monolinguals if we're in the UK or in the States. But that's already based on a faulty premise. So,
yes, and maybe one of the solutions would involve also all those who assign grants for research, right? When you study adults, you need to think in longer years. I mean, more years, to prepare, to find, to set up the questionnaires and evaluate all the data, etc. So maybe instead of having 3 years already, 6 years or 10 years, that would be good. So in order to have these things, I'm just putting it out there. I don't know if maybe someone who makes this happen would listen. That would be nice.
Well, it takes a lot of years to study children properly also.
Yes.
Like I just published a study on Polish-German 3.5-year-old children, where I compared their knowledge of Polish. One group had Polish and German from birth, and the other group only had Polish from birth. And I already found a difference at age 3.5 in how well those kids knew Polish, with the ones who only had Polish from birth knowing it better. But, to get those data from just a total of 30 families or 28 families, to find those families took already 2.5 years. And that was at the beginning of the study. And then I had to wait, because there were various waves of data collection until they were actually 3.5 years old. And that took another 1.5 years. So we were looking at 4 years or 4.5 years of the study data collection. Usually for like a doctorate in Germany, you only get 3 years basically. So you couldn't do this study.
No. Why? They could take a little bit longer and then have these studies that actually, help us understand even more about all of this. Yeah. So
it's a problem.
It is indeed.
Funding is a problem, definitely.
It is a problem. And maybe we find someone who would like to support these kind of studies. We never know. We just put it out there. Somehow, maybe it comes back. I'm always very optimistic in that. So how can we actually now, those who are following us today, who are going to watch this, and whoever is interested in this, how can we help spread the word about bilingual usage in its own right? I quote you here, I think from your article as well.
Well, obviously, initiatives such as this one might help. Who knows? And a person commented, "How can we change the attitude of teachers and pediatric doctors so that the monolingual bias is reduced?" Well, I've been working on this for 4 decades. I continue. It's a lot of work that's needed.
Would you say it's improving? Over the 4 decades?
Well, I think that
more awareness?
I would think that in educational settings in Europe, that there is a lot more openness and a lot more realization of what's going on. I believe there is an improvement compared to 4 decades ago. Now, pediatricians is a different matter, but what pediatrician is going to listen to a linguist, a mere linguist, who's not a medical doctor? there are hierarchies amongst professions as well. Now, I have spoken to pediatricians, or I've been invited to speak at pediatric conferences where I'm, saying similar things that I said here. Well, people don't like to hear it.
Mm-hmm.
Can we change that? Well, yeah, maybe I could have earlier by trying to get a teaching assignment in the medical schools, for instance, because they don't learn about bilingualism in medical school. They don't learn much about language acquisition generally either. No. But anyway, some things do change. But like, for instance, in Germany, a situation that most recently I know best is like the speech and language associations. They have excellent material on bilingual children, which is correct and follows the literature. But at the same time, you have then the pediatrics associations who don't take any notice of that. They just don't take any notice because they still have a strong monolingual bias. So it's really tough. But all we can do is continue and continue and continue.
Yes. And I think what you just mentioned made me think, why not hold a talk at one of their conferences when it's about something completely different? So being invited and yes, somehow raising the awareness of looking outside of your own, I'm now thinking in German, über den Tellerrand hinausschauen. So to look out of your boxes, or to think out of the box, and to include other kind of perspectives and disciplines as well. So in order to make them learn from each other. I mean, the same way we learned a lot from neuroscience, we learn a lot from many other fields about the development of the brain of children, right, in the past years. And so why not? Yeah, but it's true. Let's hope that people will watch this. Let's just share it everywhere.
Well, our humble little efforts, if it helps one person, one family, 10 families, it builds. And then with people who thank us like this, that's what drives our motivation, keeps us going. And experts like Professor De Houwer, that that we're here to try to bridge that gap and really bring it to the forefront. We've got lots of people now chiming in. Thank you very much. Thank you for mentioning Germany as an example. I agree that there's a strong monolingual bias, especially in early childhood education.
True, but at the same time, especially because I have spoken to many, many, many people in early childhood education in Germany, there's also a lot of awareness and openness. And in fact, I'm extremely impressed with German early education if I compare that to Flanders, France, Spain, United Kingdom, etc., etc. In Germany, many people often think, oh, they're so bad. They're not so bad. They're pretty good in many cases. So that's really positive, and they're willing to listen and think about things and discuss things. And I think that's great. I think that's great.
There's a great question. Oh, sorry. Yes. I think we clicked at the same moment. Tanya Rahman says, will multidisciplinary studies involving pediatricians to look at bilingual development help convince them to understand the issues related to bilingual development?
Well, you can give it a try, and you can try to engage pediatricians in studies, but I think that'll be extremely hard. I'm not sure exactly how they could be involved. Sorry?
I'm thinking, what's in it for them in a study about languages?
Yes.
Yes, unless there's a Facebook user that is nice. You need to find a pediatrician raising multilingual children. They will listen. So
there's a great idea. There is a great idea.
That's a great idea. So let's look for a pediatrician with raising multilingual children. Okay. We have a goal. Well, great.
Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you, Professor De Houwer. I do have one last comment from Najwa. Again, she's seeking for recommendations for for literature. So
Yeah.
perhaps after the session, we could put this into the comments, something that we recommend for
Yeah, there are
articles,
two
studies.
chapters I wrote that refer to that specifically. Yeah.
That's fantastic. So we'll be able to follow up afterwards. So thank you everybody on YouTube and on Facebook for this very active session. It was highly enriching. I totally enjoyed it, and seeing things from different perspectives. And I really appreciate the point where we were able to define clearly monolingual and bilingual. That allowed me to see a different perspective on what I was thinking in terms of advantages, disadvantages for comparing bilinguals versus monolinguals. It totally turned it around for me. Thank you very much. I do see other comments coming in, but it's lots of this is about thank you, thank you, thank you. I think we cannot emphasize it enough.
Yes.
Right.
Okay, so we will be here again with our next expert. Would you like to say a little word?
We will share in due time.
In due time, but we will be here, Uta and myself, every week at the same time on Tuesday, 1 p.m. my time, Eastern North America, and 6 p.m. Central European time. All right, we're just going to be talking about everything and anything that has to do with raising multilingual kids. Thank you, everybody, and we'll be talking to you again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for asking me. Thanks very much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.